Some stories from history aren't just disturbing, they're unexplainable. In 1846, Charleston witnessed a chain of tragedies so chilling that even newspapers refused to print her name. She was known only as the Old Slave Woman, a figure traded between 4 wealthy families, and wherever she went, ruin followed. Fires broke out, children fell ill, fortunes disappeared, and those who wronged her never lived to speak of it. Was she a victim of cruelty, or something far more powerful than anyone understood? Tonight, we'll uncover the eerie tale of the elderly slave woman who left 4 families in ruin. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell, because every story here comes from hours of researching lost archives, faded newspapers, and forgotten slave records that history tried to erase. In the year 1846, Charleston stood as one of the wealthiest cities in the American South, a place built on elegance, trade, and the brutal labor of the enslaved. Beneath the polished cobblestone streets and grand plantation homes lay an undercurrent of fear and superstition. It was in this world that an elderly slave woman arrived, her presence unnoticed at first, her story already heavy with sorrow. No one knew exactly where she came from. Some said she had been sold from Georgia. Others whispered she was brought from the Caribbean, where darker, older traditions of faith and power were said to linger. Her name was recorded in the ledger simply as Abena, though some later called her the Silent One, because she rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice carried a weight that unsettled even the cruelest overseer. She was frail, wrapped in tattered cloth, her back bent from decades of labor, her eyes distant yet sharp. To the plantation owners, she seemed harmless, too old to work the fields, too weak to pose a threat. They saw only her age and silence, but the other enslaved people noticed something different. They said her gaze lingered too long, that her prayers were whispered not in English, but in a language that sounded ancient, melodic, and strange. At night, she sat by the fire alone, humming songs that no one could understand. Some said she was calling to spirits. Others said she was remembering home. When she arrived in Charleston, she was purchased by a wealthy rice planter named Thomas Gley. His plantation lay just outside the city, surrounded by swamps that seemed to breathe mist even under the sun. Gley had been searching for a domestic servant to tend his ailing wife, and the old woman seemed a perfect fit, cheap, quiet, obedient. He could not have known that her arrival would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would unravel not just his family, but 3 others connected by greed and cruelty. From the first day, strange things began to happen. The dogs that roamed the yard howled endlessly at night, staring toward the servant quarters where Abena slept. The Gley children complained of bad dreams, visions of someone standing by their beds, whispering words they couldn't understand. The plantation's cook swore she saw the old woman standing in the moonlight, with her hands raised toward the house, murmuring softly. Within weeks, small misfortunes began to plague the family. A horse broke its leg in the stable without cause. One of the workers fell ill with fever. Then Mrs. Gley, the mistress of the house, began to weaken. Her sickness had been mild before, but suddenly her body failed rapidly, as if something unseen was draining the life from her. The enslaved workers whispered that the old woman carried something with her, a shadow that clung to her like smoke. They said she had once been forced to watch her children sold away, and that the grief had hollowed her soul. Some believed that grief had drawn spirits to her side, spirits that punished those who inflicted pain. But the Greeleys refused to listen. To them, she was nothing more than a slave, an object to be used. Yet when Mrs. Greeley died within a month of her arrival, her husband's gaze turned toward Abina with suspicion. He didn't understand what he was seeing, only that the air around her felt colder, heavier, and that every time she passed, the candles seemed to flicker low. Her arrival marked a turning point in Charleston's whispered history. She had come from nowhere, carried nothing but an old satchel, and yet after she entered that household, nothing was the same. Her silence became more terrifying than any scream, her presence more haunting than any ghost. Though no one could yet prove it, those who lived on the Greeley plantation would later say that the day the old woman arrived was the day the first curse took root in Charleston soil, a curse that would spread through 4 families and leave ruin in its wake. The Greeley household was already uneasy when the first tragedy struck, but no one could have imagined how quickly it would come. In the weeks after the elderly woman's arrival, the rhythm of life on the plantation began to change in subtle, unsettling ways. The servants spoke of her softly, afraid to say her name aloud after dark. Animals reacted strangely to her presence. Mules refused to move when she passed. Chickens stopped laying eggs, and the family's old hunting dog hid under the porch whenever she came near. Even Thomas Greeley, who prided himself on being a man of reason, began to feel the tension pressing against his home like an invisible hand. The old woman worked in silence, tending to the ailing Mrs. Greeley with a care that seemed genuine. She moved slowly but deliberately, her wrinkled hands mixing herbs into teas and poultices that eased pain and calmed fevers. For a short while her presence seemed almost beneficial. The mistress's pain lessened, the household ran smoothly, and Greeley allowed himself to believe that perhaps the rumors surrounding her were nothing more than plantation superstition. But that fragile peace didn't last. One night during a thunderstorm that shook the house, Mrs. Greeley's screams pierced the air. The servants rushed to her room to find her thrashing violently, eyes wide in terror, gasping for breath as if something unseen were choking her. The elderly woman was by her bedside, holding her hand, murmuring words no one could understand. Her voice was low, rhythmic, almost like chanting. When Greeley burst into the room, lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the old woman's face. It was calm, almost serene, while the dying woman's expression was twisted in agony. Moments later, Mrs. Greeley went still. The silence that followed was worse than the storm itself. Greeley stood frozen, staring at his wife's lifeless body, then turned his eyes to the old woman. She didn't flinch, didn't weep. She simply looked at him and whispered something under her breath before leaving the room. He would later swear that her words were not of this world, that they carried the sound of something ancient and cold. From that night on, nothing in the Greeley home felt right. Doors creaked open on their own, strange knocks echoed through the walls, and a faint smell of burnt herbs hung in the air long after the fires were out. Within days, Greeley's luck began to unravel. His crops failed unexpectedly, shipments of rice spoiled before reaching the market, and one of his overseers was thrown from a horse and killed instantly. The townsfolk began to talk. Some said the old woman had cursed the land. Others believed Greeley's cruelty had finally drawn divine punishment. But what none of them knew was that the old woman's story was far older and darker than any of them could imagine. Her calmness after Mrs. Greeley's death frightened everyone. The other enslaved workers avoided her completely, refusing to eat or sleep near her quarters. One man claimed to have seen her standing in the fields long after midnight, whispering to the wind. Another swore he saw shadows moving around her when there was no moonlight. Greeley, tormented by grief and paranoia, tried to sell her, but no trader would take her. Rumors had spread that she carried a curse that killed masters and brought sickness to any house that bought her. The breaking point came when one of Greeley's children fell ill. His youngest son, barely 8 years old, woke one morning with a high fever that no doctor could explain. As his condition worsened, the boy cried out, saying that the old woman was sitting by the door, watching him while he slept. Greeley snapped. He stormed into her quarters, shouting accusations, demanding to know what she had done. The woman did not answer. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "You took what was mine. Now you'll see what's yours." The boy died the next morning. That was the moment Charleston began to whisper about the Greeley curse. The old woman was sold soon after, though it was said that the man who bought her ignored every warning. Within weeks of arriving at her new home, tragedy followed again. Those who had doubted before now believed completely. Wherever she went, death went too. And in Charleston, her name became something no one dared to speak at night. After the tragedy at the Greeley plantation, word of the old woman spread like wildfire through Charleston's slave markets and the quiet halls of its grand estates. The story of her presence, of how she arrived silently and left only after a family was destroyed, grew darker with each retelling. Some called her cursed. Others said she was a conjure woman, someone who carried ancient powers that no chain could bind. But among the enslaved community, she was spoken of with a mixture of awe and fear. They did not call her evil. They said she was touched, that something deep and unseen walked with her, a spirit that punished cruelty when human justice would not. When the Greeley estate began to collapse after her departure, its master ruined, its crops rotting, its children buried, no one doubted any more that she had brought something unnatural with her. And yet she was sold again, this time to a wealthy merchant named Samuel Hargrove, whose Charleston townhouse overlooked the harbor. Hargrove prided himself on his skepticism. He believed in money, not in ghosts or curses. When he heard about the old woman, he laughed it off, claiming he would break her spirit like any other slave. But the enslaved people in his household trembled the moment she was brought through the door. From her first day there, strange signs appeared. The air in the servants' quarters grew colder. The house cat that had roamed the halls for years suddenly refused to enter her room. At night, the servants whispered that they heard her murmuring to herself, her words low and rhythmic, like prayers not meant for mortal ears. Some claimed to see lights flicker near her door, even when the candles were out. Still, she performed her duties without question, cleaning, cooking, tending to the hearth. Nothing about her behavior seemed threatening, yet the unease in the house deepened. Then the accidents began again. A servant girl fell down the stairs after claiming she saw the old woman standing silently behind her. Hargrove's wife, a nervous woman by nature, began suffering from terrible headaches and fits of dizziness. One night she awoke screaming, insisting she had felt someone's cold hand resting on her throat. Hargrove, furious and desperate to keep control of his household, confronted the old woman, accusing her of witchcraft. She said nothing, only looked at him with those same heavy, unblinking eyes that had unsettled Gley before him. "Your house is already broken," she said quietly. "You just haven't seen the cracks." Within weeks, Hargrove's business began to crumble. Ships he invested in sank mysteriously before reaching port. Debts piled up faster than he could pay them. His wife grew weaker by the day, her skin pale, her eyes sunken. When she finally died, the doctor said it was exhaustion, nothing more. But every servant in the household knew better. They said the old woman had been seen outside her mistress's room the night before, humming softly, her fingers tracing strange symbols in the air. By now, even the merchants and planters of Charleston, men who prided themselves on logic and dominance, had begun to fear her. They whispered that the old woman carried the spirits of the dead with her, that every lash, every cruelty she had endured had bound those spirits to her will. She never sought revenge, they said. It came to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Those who crossed her were not punished by her hand, but by something that moved through her, something that fed on injustice and grief. When Hargrove finally died, collapsed in his study, his face frozen in terror, the story took on a life of its own. The townspeople said he had been found clutching a lock of grey hair in his hand. No one could explain how it got there. By then, no one dared to keep the old woman in Charleston any longer. She was sold again, this time at a loss, passed off to another plantation far inland. But her legend followed before she even arrived. People whispered that she was the embodiment of every sin the city had buried, that her curse was not vengeance, but balance. Wherever she went, the cruelty of masters would find its reckoning. And in Charleston, her story became a warning passed from one enslaved generation to the next. Do not harm what cannot die. The plantation she was sent to after the Hargrove tragedy belonged to the Mallister family, wealthy landowners known for their temper and their pride. Their estate sat deep in the marshlands outside Charleston, surrounded by misty fields and the cries of night birds. The eldest son, Jonathan Mallister, had purchased the old woman for a fraction of her worth after hearing she was trouble. He laughed at the rumors, convinced that her fearsome reputation would make the other enslaved people obey faster. But what he didn't understand was that fear works both ways. It infects not only the oppressed, but the oppressor, slowly, silently, until it rots everything it touches. From the first night she arrived, the Mallister plantation felt different. Workers whispered that the air had grown thicker, heavier, like a storm that never broke. The old woman was given a small cabin on the edge of the property, far from the main house, as if Jonathan instinctively wanted her kept apart. Yet every morning she was there, early, at the kitchen hearth, her wrinkled hands steady as she cooked for the household. Her food, though simple, had an odd fragrance, smoky, earthy, unfamiliar. Some claimed that no one could eat her cooking without dreaming strange dreams that night. At first, nothing dramatic happened. The Mallisters believed they had tamed her, turned her into a quiet old servant. But beneath the surface, the household began to unravel. Jonathan's wife, Clara, who was known for her fragile nerves, started waking at night, saying she heard whispers outside her window. Their youngest daughter began sleepwalking, often stopping right outside the old woman's cabin before returning to bed, eyes still closed. The overseers complained that the enslaved people had become restless and uneasy. They whispered that the witch woman had come again, and that the land would soon bleed like the others. One evening a fire broke out in the fields. The sky turned red with smoke as workers tried desperately to contain it, but the flames seemed to move against the wind, spreading toward the Mallister home. When the fire finally died, it had destroyed an entire section of their crops, strangely stopping just short of the old woman's cabin. Not a single ember had touched her roof. When asked about it, she simply said, "Fire knows what it should take." The overseer spat at her feet, but no one dared to strike her. There was something about her eyes, calm, endless, ancient, that froze even the cruelest man in place. After that night, Jonathan Mallister became obsessed. He forbade anyone from speaking to her and ordered that her meals be left outside her cabin. But isolation only seemed to make her power stronger. Livestock began dying without reason. Tools rusted overnight. The plantation's well turned murky and foul, forcing the family to fetch water from miles away. Clara fell ill next, her skin blistering with a fever that no doctor could cure. In her delirium, she screamed that the old woman stands at my bed every night, though Jonathan swore he had locked her inside her cabin. The breaking point came one humid night when thunder rolled across the marshes. Jonathan awoke to find his daughter missing. He followed muddy footprints through the fields, his lantern flickering in the storm. The trail led straight to the old woman's door. When he burst inside, the cabin was dark, except for a single candle burning low. His daughter sat in the corner, silent, eyes glassy. The old woman stood beside her, humming softly. Jonathan drew his pistol, shouting for her to release the child. The old woman only turned her gaze to him and said, "You can't free what was already taken." Before he could fire, the candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. When the overseers arrived, they found Jonathan unconscious on the floor, his pistol discharged into the wall. His daughter was unharmed, but could not remember what had happened. The old woman was gone, vanished into the storm without a trace. No one saw her leave, and no tracks were found the next morning, though the mud was deep enough to hold any footprint. Jonathan never recovered. He grew paranoid and reclusive, convinced that she would return for him. Within a year, his mind broke completely. Some said they still heard him shouting her name in the empty fields at night, begging for forgiveness, and though she was gone, the Mallister estate never healed. Crops refused to grow, and one by one the family members left or died off. The house eventually fell to ruin, consumed by vines and silence. The enslaved people who remained told their children the story of the night the elder woman of ashes walked into the storm, and how she left behind only ruin for those who had forgotten mercy. By the time the old woman vanished from the Mallister estate, her story had become more than rumor. It had become folklore, a living nightmare whispered in every corner of Charleston and beyond. Her name was never spoken aloud, for people believed even saying it could invite tragedy. She was called only the Elder, the Ashen One, or the Widow of Shadows. Merchants, overseers, and plantation owners passed her tale between themselves as both warning and entertainment. But deep down, all of them shared the same unspoken fear, that the old woman was not merely human, that she carried with her the weight of every life broken by slavery, and wherever she walked, justice, dark, ancient, and merciless, followed in her wake. Months after she disappeared, she was sighted again near the outskirts of Charleston. A fisherman claimed to have seen her standing barefoot at the edge of the marsh, her white hair whipping in the wind, staring out toward the water as if waiting for something or someone. Others said they found small piles of bones arranged in perfect circles along the shoreline, mixed with herbs that no one could identify. To the enslaved, these signs meant she was calling on the spirits, preparing for something far larger than a single curse. It was around this time that the Montro's family entered her story, the fourth and final house she would leave in ruin. The Montroses were one of Charleston's most powerful families, their estate known for both its beauty and its cruelty. Edward Montrose, the patriarch, prided himself on discipline. He was known to punish his slaves in front of guests, treating their suffering as a form of entertainment. When his foreman brought him word that an elderly slave woman had been found wandering near the docks, half-starved and silent, he didn't hesitate to purchase her for nearly nothing. He laughed when warned that she might bring misfortune, saying, "If she's cursed, then let her curse my enemies instead." From the first moment she entered the Montrose home, a chill seemed to follow. The household servants grew uneasy. The horses refused to approach the stables after sunset. Edward's wife, Margaret, fell ill almost immediately. Plagued by nightmares so vivid, she began refusing to sleep. She claimed she saw the old woman standing in her dreams, always at the foot of her bed, whispering things she couldn't remember upon waking. Edward dismissed it all as hysteria, but he began to notice strange things too. His business partners backing out of deals without reason, his ledgers vanishing overnight, his fortune thinning like mist. The slaves in the Montrose fields said they had seen the elder at night, walking between the rows of sugar cane, her hands trailing along the stalks as if feeding them. Wherever she passed, the plants blackened by morning. When confronted, she never resisted or explained. She simply said, "This land remembers what was buried here." That cryptic phrase spread quickly among the workers, igniting fear and fascination. Some even began to revere her, secretly leaving offerings, bits of food, beads, flowers outside her quarters, hoping to appease whatever spirit lived within her. Then, in the late summer of 1846, the Montrose curse began in earnest. First, Edward's eldest son, Daniel, fell from his horse and broke his neck in front of the stables. Days later, his youngest daughter wandered into the marsh and was found drowned in shallow water, her face oddly serene. The family's remaining children were sent away to relatives in Savannah, but even that didn't stop the unraveling. Edward's rice barns caught fire without explanation, and his wife's health worsened until she could no longer speak. The townsfolk began to whisper that the Montroses were doomed, that they had taken in a soul who carried the weight of death itself. Finally, one night, Edward confronted her in a drunken rage. The house servants later said they heard him shouting, the crash of glass, and then a terrible silence. When they entered the parlor, Edward was slumped in his chair, eyes open, lips blue, a look of horror frozen on his face. The old woman was standing over him, her expression unreadable. She didn't run. She simply said, "He heard them now," and walked out into the rain. No one ever saw her again after that night. Some claimed she walked into the marsh and disappeared beneath the water. Others swore she boarded a ship headed north under a false name, her curse carried with her. But the Montro's family was finished, its fortune gone, its estate abandoned. And Charleston was left haunted, not just by her memory, but by what she represented, a reckoning that could not be escaped. Born from centuries of cruelty and silence, even decades later, freedmen and townsfolk alike would speak of her in hushed tones. They said she wasn't a witch, nor a demon, but a vessel, chosen by something far older than man's laws to balance the scales of suffering. Every family that owned her had fallen, not by chance, but by consequence. And though her body may have vanished into the earth or the sea, her legend never did. The elderly slave woman who ruined 4 families became a ghost story that outlived them all, a reminder that blood, once spilled unjustly, never stays buried forever. Years after the destruction of the Montro's family, the story of the elderly slave woman had spread far beyond Charleston. It had become something between history and haunting, retold by sailors in distant ports, whispered by field hands in the dark, and even feared among the wealthy who ruled the plantations. But those who truly knew the story said it did not end with the Montroses. There were sightings, always the same description. An old woman with pale eyes, walking alone, speaking little, but bringing ruin wherever she stayed. Some said she was no longer flesh and blood, but something in between, part spirit, part memory, sustained by the pain of those who had wronged her kind. Around 1850, a merchant ship docked in Charleston, carrying goods from Havana. Among its crew was a man who told a chilling tale. He claimed that weeks earlier, his ship had taken aboard an elderly woman from a Louisiana port, said to be a freed slave traveling north. The captain, not believing the local warnings, allowed her passage. But soon after she boarded, strange things began to happen. The compass spun without reason, the wind died, and men began to quarrel violently among themselves. Within days, 2 sailors were dead, one drowned, another hanged in the lower deck. The merchant said the woman never spoke, never ate, only sat near the bow, humming to herself in the dark. When the captain finally tried to confront her, lightning struck the mast, splitting it clean in 2. By morning, the woman was gone. The sea, the man said, had taken her back. Word of that voyage reached Charleston quickly. For the enslaved and the newly freed, the story became proof that she had transcended death, that her spirit now moved freely between land and sea, punishing greed and cruelty wherever she found it. But among the white elite, her tale was a curse they could not escape. Her name became forbidden. The more they tried to bury it, the deeper it rooted itself in the soil of their estates. New families who bought the abandoned Montrose or Mallister lands reported crops dying without cause. Animals vanishing, and a voice, low and weary, heard at night saying, "You have not yet paid." In one recorded account from 1852, a Charleston priest wrote of being summoned to bless a house near the ruins of the old Gley estate. The new owner, a northern investor, complained of a presence that walks the halls. The priest claimed that during his visit, the air grew so cold his candle froze mid-drip, and a faint humming echoed from the upstairs rooms. When he followed the sound, he found a mark burned into the wall, a handprint small and withered, yet seared as though by fire. The man sold the house days later, abandoning it without collecting his belongings. Among the enslaved, however, her legacy was not one of terror, but of justice. They said she had been chosen by something older than man, that she carried the weight of every soul who had died in bondage. They told stories around the fires at night that she still walked the roads unseen, guiding those who fled toward freedom, cursing those who profited from pain. Mothers warned their children never to mock her name. Elders prayed for her peace, believing she bore too much sorrow to rest. Some said that in the final years before the Civil War, she appeared one last time. A Union soldier stationed along the Carolina coast wrote in his diary that he met an old woman dressed in tattered gray, carrying a bundle of herbs and bones. She told him, "The storm's almost here. The debt's coming due." When he turned to look again, she was gone. Days later, their camp was struck by a hurricane that scattered the regiment. The soldier survived and kept her story alive, passing it down to his children, who swore it was true. By the time slavery ended, the elderly slave woman had become more than a ghost. She was a legend of reckoning, a symbol that cruelty never fades quietly. Her tale outlasted every family that had once owned her, their mansions reduced to ruins, their names forgotten, while hers endured. Even in modern Charleston, some say her presence lingers in the marshes when the tide is low and the fog rolls in thick. Locals whisper that if you listen closely, you can still hear her humming, the same low tune she sang while stirring her pot, the sound of an unending sorrow turned into power. She became the spirit of resistance itself, neither saint nor demon, but something that demanded the living remember the sins they tried to erase. And perhaps that is why her story refuses to die, because she is not just one woman from 1846. She is every voice that was silenced, every hand that was chained, every cry that went unheard. Bound by blood and pain, she became the shadow of justice, one that would haunt Charleston forever. By the mid-1850s, Charleston had changed, at least on the surface. The city's slave market still thrived, the mansions gleamed whiter than ever, and the wealthy families pretended the whispers of the past had faded. But beneath the elegance, the memory of the elderly slave woman, the one who had ruined 4 families, remained like a wound that refused to heal. Her name had become legend, woven into sermons, slave songs, and superstitions. The elders said she was still out there, neither dead nor alive, moving like smoke through the low-country marshes, drawn to any place where cruelty still lived. Then came the Whitlock family, a new name in Charleston, but one quickly marked by the same arrogance that had doomed those before them. Elias Whitlock, a cotton merchant from Savannah, bought one of the abandoned estates on the edge of the city, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, of the history that clung to the land. It was once part of the Montro's holdings, and though overgrown and silent, the locals avoided it. When his foreman tried to warn him that the land carries death in its roots, Whitlock laughed. "I believe in profit, not ghosts," he said, echoing the same fatal words of those before him. Within a month of his moving in, the first signs appeared. Servants reported seeing a woman wandering the fields at night, thin, gray-haired, moving with a strange stillness. When they called out to her, she vanished into the fog. The Whitlocks blamed exhaustion and imagination, but soon the unease seeped into the house itself. Doors opened by themselves. The scent of burning herbs drifted through rooms where no fire burned. The youngest child began sleep-talking in a voice that was not her own, repeating the same phrase over and over, "She's come to finish it." Elias Whitlock tried to restore the land, cutting down the twisted oaks that surrounded the house. But each morning, new branches appeared, coiling toward the walls like fingers. His wife grew pale and withdrawn, claiming she could hear humming at night, the same melody that servants said the old woman used to sing while working by the hearth. Even the family's preacher, when called to bless the property, left abruptly after only an hour, refusing to return. He told Whitlock quietly, "There are things here that do not answer to God." As the tension deepened, so did Whitlock's desperation. He believed the stories now, though he'd never admit it aloud. He forbade the enslaved workers from speaking of her, from lighting candles, from whispering prayers. But the silence only made the house colder. One by one, the workers began to disappear, vanishing in the night without struggle, without a trace. Their absence went unnoticed until a storm rolled in from the coast, bringing with it the final reckoning. That night, lightning struck the old magnolia tree near the family's front gate. The tree split in two, and from the crack poured a swarm of crows, hundreds of them, circling the house like a living storm cloud. Inside, the walls trembled as the wind screamed through the windows. The family huddled together, terrified. Then, as if carried on the wind itself, a voice rose from the storm, low, rhythmic, and unmistakably human. "4 families paid their due," it said. "One remains." Elias ran to the front door, pistol in hand, shouting into the darkness. He saw her then, an old woman standing barefoot in the rain, her grey dress clinging to her frame, her eyes glowing faintly in the lightning. She didn't move. She simply looked at him, tilting her head slightly, and whispered something lost beneath the thunder. When the lightning struck again, she was gone. But the next morning, Elias Whitlock was found dead at the base of the magnolia tree, his heart stopped, his face frozen in terror. The estate was abandoned once more. Within weeks, the fields were swallowed by the marsh, and the house began to sink into the earth. Locals said the land had finally taken back what was owed. Those who dared to pass by after dark claimed to see faint lights moving through the fog, or hear a woman's voice humming softly from the ruins. They said it was the elder's last act, the completion of her grim cycle. But even that wasn't the true end. Years later, freedmen rebuilding Charleston after the war found the remains of the Whitlock property. Among the rubble, they discovered carvings etched into the foundation stones, symbols no one could decipher. An old man who'd once been enslaved on the Montro's estate looked at them and said quietly, "She marked it, so it can't begin again." And so, the legend of the elderly slave woman came full circle. She had destroyed 4 families and silenced a 5th. Her vengeance or justice, depending on who told the story, was complete. But her spirit remained, not as a ghost of hatred, but as a shadow of truth, a reminder that blood spilled in cruelty never fades quietly. In Charleston, when the air grows still and the marsh hums low, they say she still walks, carrying the weight of every name she erased. Her song echoing through the centuries, "No sin sleeps forever." In the years following the fall of the Whitlock estate, Charleston entered a period of uneasy quiet. The Civil War loomed, and the city, once proud, rich, and untouchable, began to feel the slow decay of its sins. The wealthy spoke less of ghosts and more of politics, But the common folk, especially the newly freed and the poor, still whispered about her. The elderly slave woman had vanished once more, yet her legend grew stronger than ever. She had become a force not bound to flesh or time, a name carried in songs, prayers, and curses alike. Some called her the Shadow Mother. Others said she was the living memory of every injustice that had ever soaked the Carolina soil in blood. The stories evolved with the passing decades. Travelers told of an old woman who appeared on lonely roads to warn lost souls. Dockworkers claimed to see her reflection in the harbor water on foggy nights. In the marshlands, hunters said they heard her voice humming in the reeds, always before a storm rolled in. No one ever saw her clearly, only the outline of a frail figure, grey and still, watching from a distance. And wherever she was seen, misfortune followed. Not in the way of violence or vengeance, but in quiet, devastating ways. Ships sinking, crops dying, fortunes collapsing. The old families who had once ruled Charleston fell one by one, their names disappearing from ledgers and gravestones, leaving behind only decaying manors and rumors of a curse that began with her. But to the freedmen, her story meant something different. She was not a monster to them. She was the answer, the embodiment of retribution that the living could never deliver. Around campfires and in small church gatherings, they spoke of her not with fear, but reverence. They believed she had been chosen by something older than any faith they knew. Some said she had been marked by the spirits of Africa, those who had crossed the ocean in chains. Others claimed she was touched by God himself, sent to balance the scales when human justice refused to. Whatever she was, they agreed on one thing. She had walked among evil and left righteousness in her wake, even if it came through ruin. Decades later, in the early 1900s, a group of laborers rebuilding the coastal road near the old Mallister property uncovered something strange. Buried beneath layers of clay and root was a small iron charm, shaped like a woman with her arms crossed over her chest. The figure was old, worn smooth by time, but its presence unsettled everyone who saw it. The foreman, a local man, recognized the symbol immediately and ordered the men to bury it again. "Let her rest," he said. "That ground's hers." They did as told, and the site was quietly abandoned. The road was rerouted a year later after several workers died in unexplained accidents, yet the legend refused to sleep. In the 1920s, a black preacher in Savannah claimed that an elderly woman appeared in his congregation one stormy night. She wore a faded gray dress and carried a string of dried herbs. She sat in the last pew, listening silently as he preached about forgiveness. When the sermon ended, she stood and said in a soft, cracked voice, "Forgiveness is for the living. The dead still wait." Then she turned and walked out. No one saw her leave the church doors, but when the preacher looked outside, there were wet footprints leading into the dark. By the 1950s, historians began digging into Charleston's past, trying to separate fact from myth. They found scattered records, 4 estates that had fallen into ruin, each connected by the same transaction: the purchase of an elderly enslaved woman between 1841 and 1846. Her name was never consistent. Sometimes she was listed as Martha, other times Eldra or simply Old M. The descriptions matched: the same frail frame, silver hair, and the same unsettling calm. One researcher noted that her presence coincided with unexplainable deaths and fires. Another wrote in frustration, "It is impossible to tell where she went after 1846. It is as if she simply ceased to exist." But the locals could have told them otherwise. She didn't cease. She changed. As Charleston grew modern, the old stories were told less frequently, but they never disappeared completely. Even today, some locals claim to see her shadow near the ruins of the Montro's estate when fog rolls in from the sea. A few say they've heard her voice in the wind, humming the same melody once described by those who knew her centuries ago. Ghost tours speak her name quietly, afraid to linger on it too long. Older residents still leave offerings, small coins, shells, bits of bread, at the edge of the marsh when they pass, not from belief, but respect. And yet the meaning of her story has shifted over time. What was once told as a tale of terror is now remembered as a warning, and in a strange way a kind of comfort. The elderly slave woman became a symbol of reckoning and remembrance, proof that history cannot be buried under money, religion, or pride. She was the embodiment of consequence. Each family that fell was a lesson written in blood and grief, reminding the generations that followed that evil, especially the kind built on human suffering, never disappears without a price. To this day, the marshes near Old Charleston still fall eerily silent just before dusk. The wind dies, the crickets hush, and for a few seconds everything holds its breath. Locals say that's when she passes through, watching, waiting, ensuring that the balance remains. Because though centuries have passed and the world has changed, her vow still echoes softly through the reeds. No cruelty goes unremembered. No name escapes the debt. By the early 1900s, Charleston's skyline was changing, but beneath the progress lay shadows that refused to fade. The grand manners of the once powerful families, the Whitlocks, the Mallisters, the Montroses, and the Fletchers, stood silent, their walls blackened by time and overgrown with vines. Their wealth had vanished, their bloodlines thinned or disappeared, and their names became cautionary whispers rather than marks of prestige. It was as though the soil itself had rejected them, erasing every trace of their pride. Yet while the city rebuilt and moved forward, the story of the elderly slave woman persisted like a haunting refrain. To some she was myth, to others memory. But among the oldest families who still lived near the ruins of those estates, her presence was spoken of not as legend, but as proof. Local historians began to take interest in these strange stories as Charleston entered its second century of freedom. One historian, Thomas E. Wainwright, spent decades piecing together records of the woman who had appeared, vanished, and somehow left a trail of ruin in her wake. He found fragments of her existence in estate ledgers and slave manifests, each one documenting a transaction involving an elderly woman who should have been too old for labor, yet was still purchased and passed between wealthy homes. Her name changed constantly: Marla, Ida, Mother Gley, Old M. Wainwright's notes described her as calm, intelligent, and unsettlingly aware of her surroundings. But what disturbed him most was the pattern. Each family that owned her met with tragedy within months: a fire, a drowning, an unexplained illness. The more he studied, the more convinced he became that she was no ordinary woman. He died before publishing his findings, leaving behind only a handwritten note. Her justice was not human. By the 1930s, Spiritualists and mediums began flocking to Charleston, drawn by the rumors of a vengeful spirit bound to the land. They claimed the area surrounding the Mallister plantation pulsed with an energy of deep grief, describing sensations of pressure, sudden drops in temperature, and visions of a gray-haired woman standing at the water's edge. One medium, a woman from New Orleans, refused to return after visiting the site. She told the press she's not a ghost. She's a wound that never healed. Her words spread quickly, reigniting fear among the locals. Some families left the area entirely, abandoning homes they'd lived in for generations. Others tried to profit from the legend, offering nighttime tours and seances. Though many of those ventures ended in strange accidents, fires, illnesses, and disappearances that only fueled the curse's reputation. But amid the fear, a quieter understanding began to take root, particularly among the descendants of freed slaves. In their stories, the elderly slave woman was not a bringer of doom, but a guardian spirit. They believed she lingered to ensure that history would not repeat itself, that Charleston would remember the pain buried beneath its cobblestones and oak-lined streets. Her wrath, they said, was never aimed at the innocent. It was directed only at those who sought to erase or exploit the suffering that had built their city. For them, she became a kind of folk saint. Offerings of coins, flowers, or sweetgrass began appearing near the marshes at the edge of town, left quietly by those seeking protection or forgiveness. As the 20th century advanced, her story evolved into something much larger, a parable about power, guilt, and the unending echo of injustice. Teachers in Charleston's segregated schools would tell her story to children as a warning. Don't forget what was done here. Don't forget who paid the price. By the 1960s, during the height of the civil rights movement, her legend was revived in sermons and protests alike. Artists painted her likeness, portraying her not as a frail old woman, but as a towering figure of defiance, cloaked in storm clouds and carrying the chains of the past. Her image appeared on murals, in songs, and even in whispered prayers before marches. She had transcended myth, becoming a symbol of truth that history books could not suppress. Even in modern times, strange stories persist. Construction crews working near the old Whitlock grounds have reported finding unmarked graves and hearing faint humming beneath the soil. Visitors to the Charleston harbor claim that during foggy mornings, the water ripples unnaturally, forming the faint outline of a woman's face before fading away. Paranormal investigators have recorded temperature drops, shadow movements, and sounds resembling the rustle of a long skirt brushing over wooden floors. But perhaps the most chilling detail is the way technology fails in those places. Cameras flicker, microphones die, and GPS devices lose all signal. It's as if she rejects being captured, allowing her story to live only through the living, not through screens. What remains certain is that the curse, or perhaps the justice, of the elderly slave woman continues to breathe through Charleston's bones. She is not confined to the past. She exists in the uneasy silence between history and remembrance. Scholars may argue over whether she was real, but her legacy endures in a more profound way, as a mirror. Her story reflects what happens when cruelty is buried instead of confronted, when truth is silenced instead of spoken. The families she destroyed are long gone, but their sins remain carved into the city's memory. and she, eternal and unyielding, stands as its keeper even now. Locals say that on humid summer nights, when thunder grumbles over the bay, if you stand near the ruins of the Montro's estate and listen closely, you might hear her voice carried on the wind. It's not angry anymore, they say, just weary. A voice that whispers not of revenge, but of remembrance. A voice that asks the living only one thing: do you remember what was done to me? And those who do never forget. As the story of the elderly slave woman moved beyond Charleston's boundaries, it began to take on a life of its own, transforming from a regional haunting into a symbol of universal consequence. By the late 20th century, folklorists, authors, and filmmakers all sought to capture her legend, though none could agree on who she truly was. Some described her as a witch, a conjurer of dark spirits born from vengeance. Others saw her as a saint, burdened with the weight of every wrong inflicted on the enslaved. And yet, no matter how she was reimagined, one truth persisted across every retelling: she had been wronged beyond imagination, and her spirit refused to rest until justice had touched every name that once owned her. Modern historians began revisiting the Charleston archives with renewed curiosity, trying to uncover the factual roots behind the myth. Old letters, diaries, and church records revealed fragments of a deeper, more complex truth. One plantation record described an elderly woman named Mother Ida, purchased in 1841, despite being well past her working age. Another, dated 5 years later, noted her as missing after the fire, referring to the Montro's tragedy that wiped out an entire household in one night. A diary entry from a neighboring family described her as calm, unnerving, and always singing strange hymns at night. But the most disturbing document came from the Mallister household, a brief, trembling note written by the lady of the house that read, "She knows things she shouldn't. She speaks of our deaths as if they've already happened. As academics pieced together her existence, they realized her curse, or blessing, wasn't confined to superstition. It reflected something buried in the psychology of Charleston itself, a lingering guilt passed down through generations. The families who once profited from human misery had built their wealth on silent suffering, and in doing so they had built their own destruction. The elderly slave woman, whether real or symbolic, became the embodiment of that reckoning. Her story was a manifestation of everything Charleston tried to forget. The screams behind the mansions, the prayers whispered in shacks, and the blood mixed into the soil that still yielded their crops. She was history's conscience, returning again and again to remind the living that time does not absolve cruelty. It only conceals it. By the 1980s, her legend had become a fixture in both academic and popular culture. Universities held symposiums on the ethics of folklore and vengeance, using her tale as a central example. Writers found in her story the perfect metaphor for generational trauma, the way pain can ripple through time, haunting even those who believe themselves untouched. Filmmakers tried to bring her to life on screen, though most productions ended abruptly, some plagued by unexplained accidents. One director, interviewed years later, confessed that after filming near the ruins of the Mallister estate, he experienced nightly visions of a woman watching from the corner of my room. He abandoned the project and never returned to Charleston, but her presence was not confined to those who sought her for fame or fortune. Locals still speak of quiet encounters, of an old woman, seen walking near the marshes at dusk, her back slightly bent, her eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. She never speaks, they say, but if you stare too long, you'll hear whispers in your head, your own memories twisted with someone else's grief. Some claim she appears only to those who carry guilt in their bloodline, as though she knows the unspoken lineage of cruelty that time has tried to bury. A few have tried to challenge the legend, digging into old estates or mocking the stories publicly, but inevitably their luck turns. Fires, accidents, inexplicable illness. It's always the same. Those who disrespect her name don't last long in Charleston. For the new generation, though, her story has shifted once again. Artists, poets, and musicians have begun reclaiming her image, not as a monster, but as a spirit of justice, an eternal witness to the crimes of slavery. Murals depicting her adorn walls in downtown Charleston and New Orleans. A frail woman standing over the sea, her eyes closed, her hands raised as if calling the dead to speak. At protests and vigils, her name is sometimes invoked in chants, an invocation of strength, of history that refuses to fade. She has become a reminder that the past, no matter how brutal, cannot be buried without consequence. Today, if you visit the ruins of the Montro's estate, you'll find the air unnaturally still. Locals say the birds avoid the area, and even the wind changes direction when it nears the marsh. Visitors often leave small offerings, candles, bits of cloth, coins, at the foot of a half-buried stone believed to mark the spot where she once lived. Some claim that if you stand there at midnight, you can hear faint weeping, followed by a soft hum, the same lullaby she was said to sing while tending to her captor's children. It's not a sound of rage, but of sorrow, an eternal mourning for the generations lost and the families broken. The elderly slave woman's story has transcended history and become something sacred, an echo that binds past and present in uneasy harmony. Her curse has evolved into a lesson that no cruelty, no matter how deeply buried, disappears forever. It stains the earth, the air, the bloodlines of those who benefited from it. And when justice does not come from man, it comes from something far older, something that waits patiently in the dark until the time is right. Even now, when storms roll over Charleston and lightning flashes above the bay, locals swear they can see her silhouette standing near the shore, facing the horizon. They say she's not angry anymore, only watchful, watching the city that once enslaved her, watching the descendants of both the guilty and the innocent, watching to ensure that history never repeats itself. Because some spirits do not linger out of hatred, some linger to remember, and she, above all, remembers everything.